Welcome to part 2 of our skateboard salvage project. So for those of you that might have missed part 1, we'll do a quick catch-up. So I was out on the lakefront this weekend and I found this skateboard deck that was leaning up against a statue in the park alongside of the lake shore. And it clearly looked like it had been soaking in the lake for a very long time. We'll look at some of the details on this and kind of do some detective work about evaluating what might have happened. But my best guess is that somebody was riding along the lake shore on close to the water, and their deck shot out into the lake, and they didn't have the motivation to fish it out, so there it rested until someone swimming there must have seen it and dragged it up, and been thrilled to have found a skateboard, but probably disappointed to find that its condition was in pretty rough shape. So anyway, just to get it home, I had to, because I was biking, I had to bust the deck in half, which was not hard to do given its condition, and strap it to my bike rack and bring it home. And so I've done a little bit of homework, and because we live in the golden age of the internet, it's so easy to find information about things like who manufactured the deck and where the parts and pieces might have come from. And it's important to understand that when it comes to buying complete decks, 99.9% of the time, those companies are going to have a branded deck, but are going to be buying parts and pieces from other manufacturers to build out that deck. So this particular deck was made by a company called Gravity Skateboards, and it has its own branded wheels on it that are 76 millimeter 80As. And it has gull-wing sidewinder trucks on it. So I did a little bit of homework and looked up some of the features of those trucks and some of the particulars about trying to source parts. And when it comes to sourcing parts, it is almost effortless to buy these things online, but I have to tell you that whenever possible, I like to try to support local businesses. So I'm going to go to my local skate shop, Uprise, and see if I can't source the parts through them. It's for sure going to cost me more than buying it through a company like Amazon, but if you believe like I do that it's important to support local businesses, then you might be willing to pay a little bit more for those parts to keep your local skate shop in business, because in this new era of coronavirus, keeping a business open is, exceptionally difficult. So I'm going to touch base with Uprise tomorrow when they're open and see about sourcing some of the parts for this particular skateboard. But if I can't buy local, then I'm going to try and buy regional. If I can't buy regional, then I'm going to try and buy within the state. If I can't buy within the state, I might try to purchase nationally. Making sure that it's a local company, or I'm sorry, a stateside-based company that I'm sourcing through, again, because I believe that we have to support our own businesses whenever possible. And then if I can't, then I'll shop international. So it's not just a commitment to buying products that are being either manufactured or assembled here where I live in the U.S., but it's also about decreasing that carbon footprint of trying to minimize the shipping requirements, because to have stuff shipped across from the other side of the world has a carbon footprint associated with it, which has an environmental impact. So anyway, those are just a few considerations. So what I've done is I've gathered up some of the tools that I'm going to need for this project. Among the things that we're going to need for sure is a rust release penetrating lubricating fluid like this WD-40. It's going to probably take a pretty good soak on most of this hardware to get it freed up enough that I'm able to loosen it up. And where I might be able to get away with using an inexpensive or mid-range skate wrench like I have here, Instead, I'm most likely going to turn to something like these cone wrenches, which are much more solid-bodied and less likely to strip out when I go to try to take some of these parts and pieces apart. And I may be able to draw on some of the hardware that I have or that I've collected over the years for other build-off projects. Like I might be able to reuse some of these risers that I have, or I may have things like king bolts or bushings or other types of hardware that I have here in this jar to be able to do something with the parts and pieces that I'm salvaging. So we can see that the deck is beyond any hope. It's completely delaminated. The wheels look like they're still in pretty decent shape, but I know for sure that I'll have to replace all of the hardware, including the bearings, because those are completely trashed. And then the double king bolt that goes through these particular gull-wing trucks will definitely need to be replaced, and the bushing and probably bushing cups. So when we get in there and bust that apart, we'll get a better look at it. So first thing I'm going to want to do is try to take the trucks off the deck. Then I'm going to get in and bust these barnacles, or all of these, not barnacles, but all of these zebra mussels, which are an invasive species in Lake Michigan. I'm going to try and clean all those parts and pieces off before I come in with that rust-busting penetrating liquid. Because water is really, it's a great solvent for the first step of cleaning things up. So let's see if I can't knock those parts off and see where we're at. It's most likely that among the first skateboards that were ever ridden were roller skates that were attached to a plank of wood. Okay? And so that plank of wood was ultimately replaced by wooden decks that were commercially produced. And the advantages of making decks out of wood were that it was very inexpensive and to manufacture wooden decks, and they were so they're economical and they're relatively durable. These days, solid wood decks are generally made for the aesthetic properties of that wood. So, you know, the woods can have beautiful grain characteristics to them, and so you'll see some solid wood decks out there, but they are, in general, they're pretty expensive. And solid wood decks have a kind of Achilles heel or a weakness to them, and that is that the grain of wood runs in the direction that the tree was growing. So the grain of the wood is what we call longitudinal. So it's like a bundle of fibers all held together along that grain of the wood. And when you start to put holes through to make attachments for things like trucks, the closer that hole gets to the edge of the wood, the more likely it is to split or crack running along with those long linear strands of that grain. So the one solution to the challenge was to take thin sheets of wood and to glue those thin sheets of wood, stacking them up with the grain of the wood, alternating direction every other layer. So that means that you're able to gain a combination of resistance to breaking, because there's no one grain direction that fastener might compromise by chasing out to a crack on the end, because they're in alternating layers, the grain going this direction on the first layer, and then you can see that end grain presenting itself going the opposite direction on this layer, the opposite direction on this layer, and so on and so forth. That not only gave you the resistance to tear out of and cracking around the trucks, It also gave the ability to have a deck that was both flexible, and flex has a lot of benefit to it because you can feel the road surface underneath you, and it is more like riding a wave, which was really, you know, the origins of skateboard design or sidewalk surfing was to be able to do what you could do on land, what you weren't able to do when there were no waves and it was flat. So anyway, so you got that flex, you got that alternating grain, and you also got the ability for the boards to be able to be shaped in a way that was that concavity on the deck that allowed you to be able to turn more readily. So we started to see things like kicktails on boards when they stack laminated those, and we started to see that camber, the cupping of the deck surface itself. So let's get a little closer and see what we can do about taking those trucks off. I used to be that person that was, you know, only read directions as a last resort. But I have to tell you that when I looked at the cost of these wheels online, which is around $35, I thought, okay, let's be careful to make sure not use anything that's going to possibly have an ill effect on these wheels. So I went ahead and just reread the directions on my can and of penetrating fluid, and I highly recommend that before you ever use aerosols of any kind, that especially if they're petroleum-based products, that you read the directions and any advisories about flammability or electrical conductivity or any kind of issues like that, to make sure that you're not potentially exposing yourself to hazardous mist or vapors that might be coming off of that. So first thing I'm going to want to do while I'm still attached to the deck so it's not bouncing around is see if I can bust those wheels off. So I'm just going to give a little shot of that penetrant up into wheel bearing and that nut. And then I'm going to get my wrench on there and see how I do for getting that off. So that is remarkable that something in this rough a condition is coming off that easily. So pleasantly surprised. So there's my nut. Next there should be a washer. Let's see if I can work this off. So that's not moving like I want it to, so I'm going to come back in and I'm going to hit that with a little bit more of that penetrating fluid and let that soak into it a little bit. I should also make sure and have a something to catch any of that penetrant that runs off so that it's not saturating my table and contaminating something else that I put on the work table later on. So I'll work my way all the way around to all the wheels and see if I can knock those guys off and then get back to you. Okay. Amazing that those wheels came off as readily as they did, but I'm very happy about that. So I went ahead and I hit the nuts that are holding the trucks onto the deck and come back in and see if those guys are going to ride off. And it's just amazing that these things aren't really bound up worse than they are. So look at that. That's what you dream about happening, and lo and behold, there it is. So I'm going to go around and take the rest of these off, and then we'll look and see what we've got. Okay, the hardware that's used to connect the trucks and the riser to the deck is typically made up of a Phillips drive, flat head, hardened screw that has a smooth shoulder, an unthreaded portion where it goes through the deck, and then a threaded portion where it exits the bottom of the deck, and it's held on with a type of locking nut called a nylock, like I have right here. And the importance of using locking nuts like this is that there's a lot of vibration, and without a locking nut or lock washers to hold that hardware in place, the vibration from the road would cause that to loosen up, and next thing you know, your trucks are falling off. So this is pretty typical, and that sometimes you'll find these in a square drive, but Phillips is the most common. And you need to understand that the size of the screw determines the size of the screwdriver or screwdriver tip. So this is a number 2, or a P2, which is the perfect fit in there. And it's so important that that screwdriver be in good shape, otherwise you might potentially just strip out the threads on there, and then you're going to be shit out of luck. So because the second nut that I tried to loosen on this just resulted in the screw spinning on the other side, I need to come in with that screwdriver and seat it, if I can even find where that is, and seat that in the threads, in the slot of the head of that, in order to get that nut to back off. So, and again, because it's so rusted, I want to make sure that I've got a lot of inward force to keep it from hopping or camming in that head and stripping it out. Now, if I couldn't get this wrench on there, then, and I didn't have an alternative wrench, I could come back in and use a cutoff wheel on a grinder to cut that off, but that would be kind of a last resort. And I don't want to take a chance of mauling up these trucks. Again, a combination of that penetrating fluid and the patience and persistence to understand what's going on there has got me 2 screws out. So let me just say that if all else fails, I could come in and I could use something like locking pliers to hold on to that nut if it's been rusted so badly that I can't get a proper wrench to fit on it. But once you go down that road with those locking pliers, it's pretty much a one-way street. You'll never be able to get a wrench back on there again. So think of locking pliers as a course of last resort. Okay, 4 nuts off. Let's see what's going on here. I'm going to gently try to rock this back and forth. Look at that. That's some kind of crusty. Woo! And there's my riser, packed full of muck. Okay, 1 down, 1 to go. Man, sakes alive, look how crusty this guy is. You can see all these little zebra mussels are attached anywhere there was a pocket that they could adhere to. I don't know if you guys know much about zebra mussels, but it's an invasive species that came in from boats that dumped what's called their bilge water. So ships, when they're empty, will take on water so that they sit lower down for navigational control. And once they put a load on, they have to dump that bilge water and get rid of it. And it is not at all unusual for parasites and organisms like zebra mussels to hitch a ride in that bilge water, and next thing you know, you have an environmental catastrophe. So anyway, moving on, time to take our second truck apart, and then we're going to clean up those wheels. When it comes to removing rusty hardware, it's often the last few threads on that piece of hardware that might have been extending out beyond the nut itself that's the most prone to damage from oxidation, or might get nicked up because it's sticking out and exposed. So as I mentioned before, I will often use locking pliers as a tool of last resort. So I got this backed all the way out to here, but it won't move any further using the screwdriver without it hopping and camming out of position. So I went ahead and pushed this as far forward as I could get it so that I could get a good bite on this with locking pliers. And now I'll come back in and see if I can't get it to just make those last tough turns. And that's it. Great. Okay, so far so good. Okay, so that last turn resulted in this screw shearing off, but it's no big deal because I can still pull it out from this side just like this. And, oh, I see I've got one more nut, and then we're free. It looks like this one machine screw is longer than all the others. So it has more threads projecting out the other side of that locking nut, or that nylock nut. So this presents a problem because the wrench that I've been using has a limited depth inside of it. And that means that because this is sticking out so far, I can't get the wrench to go deep enough in to be able to catch those threads. So if I just tried turning this, I would just be stripping or rounding over that shoulder. So they do make nut drivers that are called deep well nut drivers that will have a deeper opening in them to allow for something like a screw to post up into. But this is my last screw, so I'm probably just going to get in there, put some locking pliers on it, and hopefully it'll come off without too much fuss. I've always tried to be mindful about not being wasteful, and that's no more true than when it comes to plastic. I do everything that I can to minimize my use of plastic, but if I do have to use plastic, then I'm going to try and get as much life out of that plastic as possible so that it doesn't become a one-use item. I try to reuse the plastic containers that come with food that might have been in takeout containers, or I try to extend the use or life of the use of things like this little plastic tub, which actually was a litter box, a little mini litter box when my cat was a kitten. And now it's been repurposed as a parts tray. And parts trays are great for cleaning, especially when you have to soak things like these crusty trucks in penetrating fluid. So this does a couple things for me. One is that it allows me to thoroughly soak these, right, without worrying too much about the runoff. And it also will allow me to take any of that excess fluid that gets reserved in my little tub here, and run it through a little screen or a filter cloth, and reuse that penetrant again. So I have a little jar that when I'm done here, I'll pour this off into that jar, and it's, from my experience, it still has a lot of usefulness in it. And again, it's not just about, economy of using this material. It's about being able to get as much use out of it to minimize the environmental impact of it. Because when it comes to things like aerosols and any kind of petroleum product, it's like it has some impact on our environment. So I'm not saying don't use them, but I'm saying if you do use them in the most conscientious and responsible way that you can. Yeah, so that's my little eco-warrior lesson for the day. All right. Also, this is going to take a lot of time for this to loosen these guys up, because I can see that they're really fused. So I'm going to let this do its work and hang out overnight before I come back in and attack that. But in the meantime, back in Bucket Town, I've got my wheels soaking in a combination of hot water and vinegar. And vinegar is an excellent cleaner. It's also, in general, considered to be very eco-friendly, and it's inexpensive, and it's easily diluted. So vinegar is an acid. Even although it's excellent for salad dressings, it's also most excellent for general purpose cleaning. So anyway, we'll see you here when we move on to tuning up those trucks and replacing the crusty, damaged parts.